Thank you. This really is an unexpectedly multimedia event, so please do bear with us. We're all doing our best, but as you probably are all aware, sometimes technology does defeat us, or at least try to challenge us. So I'm Claire Langhammer, I'm Director of the Institute of Historical Research. I want to welcome everybody here today. An event like this is such a beautiful and joyful celebration of a life, of an intellect, of a colleague, of a friend, and of a family member. And it's really lovely to have so many people who knew Susan in so many different ways here today. I do want to mention a few people who are here right at the outset. Family members, and we're absolutely delighted to have members of Susan's family here with us. Felicity, Hilary, Ian, Lucy and Donald, Hugh and Morag, Christopher, Kate and Gordon. I hope I've got all of you in there. We're really pleased to have you here because these kinds of events are also events that straddle the work life and the personal life in really interesting ways. I think academia is one of those jobs where the distinctions between the private and the public can be very blurry. And that's why on occasions like today, it's important for us to think about the person, fully in the round of their life. Susan, as many of you here know far better than me, had so many multiple roles across her career. Her commitment to and contribution to the IHR was outstanding, much valued, and she was a much loved member of our community in lots of different ways over time. We'll hear more about that today. Before we start though, I just want to say a few thank yous. I want to thank Adam Chapman for putting the programme together. I want to thank Pauline Stafford and David Bates for working with Adam on this. And I want to thank Gemma Dormer at the back there, who has been running this as an event. And I also want to thank, before we start, all the speakers and the library team for putting the exhibition together. If you haven't had the chance to see the exhibition, please do so. And finally, there are some practicalities, as there always are. Toilets are on this corridor here. There is no fire alarm planned this afternoon, so if a fire alarm does go off, please do leave the building. I will make sure that you do. We do have some breaks built in to the afternoon. The first break is at 3, and there will be tea, coffee, and also cake. So on that note, I will hand over to Adam. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you to the speakers for agreeing to speak. Let's give you some sense of the format of the afternoon if you haven't had a chance to look at the programme. First session is going to be a hybrid session. It's going to be more hybrid than we initially planned, owing to circumstances beyond our control. So we are joined by Pauline Stafford in recorded form. She can't be here today for a variety of reasons, not least of which was succumbing to COVID yesterday, for which she sends her most profuse apologies, but she has prepared a recording of what she was going to say anyway, which is much preferably to be preferred than having, me read it out. We are also joined in person by Susan's former colleague, Lady Martha Hall, Francis Lanham, and by 3 of Susan's American colleagues from her time at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, Janet Lungard, Jim Dathwaite, and Peggy Brown. And they will join us via Zoom, and I think they can hear you, they can hear us, and we can certainly see them. So this is going to be a little bit of boxing and boxing to make sure the technology works. There will be time for your own reflections on Susan and her career, and organised by theme suggested in the programme. So the first session is entitled Teacher, Colleague, Friend. And Susan's life and career overlapped all of those things. And the first speaker is, as I've already alluded to, Professor Pauline Stafford. Pauline, as I say, sends her apologies. She's Professor Emerita at the University of Liverpool, where she taught many years as head of department, and is visiting professor currently at the University of Leeds. She first encountered Susan, I think, as a student, and Pauline's own work on gender and women in the 8th to the early 12th centuries is particularly well regarded and was of great inspiration to me as an undergraduate. So it's been it's a huge pleasure for me to actually be introduced to Pauline as well as to some Susan's work. As I say, she's not with us today, so she has sent us a recording, and I'm now going to share that via Zoom so that my colleagues in America can hear as well, and that should, we hope, come through on screen too. Fingers crossed.
In autumn 1964, Susan and I arrived at Lady Margaret Hall at Oxford together. I was arriving to start my first year, and she was returning to take up a post as teaching medieval history. Susan's career had, of course, already begun, and others will speak later about its earlier stages, especially her time at the Victoria County History. But that was the beginning of our acquaintance. And from that autumn until the summer of her death, Susan and I met regularly, first as teacher and pupil, and then, and largely, as friends. Outside my family, she was one of the most enduring long-term presences in my life, especially, but not exclusively, my life as a historian. Susan taught me across my 3 years as an undergraduate, I think in every year, from Bede in term 1 through to Stubbs's Charters in year 3. She always told me later that she was not in her stride as a teacher in these early stages, and I certainly don't have any memories of her formidable demands for linguistic precision, words, concepts and things which put later generations on their mettle. My clearest memories are of tutorials on Stubbs's Charters. Now, for the uninitiated, Stubbs's Charters and Constitutional Documents is a collection of sections of English record and legal sources from the Anglo-Saxon times to the early 14th century, and the exam involved detailed commentary on them. Now, these were precisely the sort of sources on which Susan's career as a historian was built, on which I think her best book, Kingdoms and Communities, was built. And from the outset, she was clearly completely at home with them. I was the only person in my year who chose to do Stubbs's Charters, which perhaps tells you more about me than I care to admit. So I had one-to-one tutorials with Susan, and I got my best mark in schools in that paper, which certainly tells you something about Susan. Susan was my undergraduate tutor, but not the supervisor of my doctorate. But she continued to take an interest in me and my work, and on one occasion she took me and Bill out to walk the boundaries of an early 11th century charter for land on Otmore, which included a picnic. I have many memories of Susan and picnics, including in France with all our family. She assured us very early on that French farmers didn't mind if you spread your picnic blanket in their fields and got out your bread, pâté and fruit. And the result was that on one famous occasion, she spread out her blanket on what was effectively someone's front lawn. Luckily, the entente cordiale held, and once the owners got over their surprise, they brought us fruit and nuts and wished us bon appétit. We and our children were acutely embarrassed, but Susan was unfazed. For the 50-odd years after I left Oxford, Susan was a recurring presence, on her visits to our family home in Leeds, and on my visits to her in central London, at seminars, but more often on walks and in discussions around the dinner table. And of course, on her memorable house parties in France, especially at La Bergerie, near Bonneguil, and at Vert in Normandy. Susan loved to walk. She was also a strong swimmer, and I can see her now disappearing down the Dordogne, her head held erect, not a hair wet when she emerged. But walking was one of her passions, and there were few visits to Britain or France which didn't involve one. In the Yorkshire Dales, usually in June, what she called her second spring in Yorkshire, though on one occasion that meant horizontally driving rain. All was followed by a rolling out of the route on the OS map, with Susan delighting when she topped the 10 miles. Most of those walks in Yorkshire involved a pub lunch and inevitably a lively discussion, with what Susan herself called her Harrod's lady's voice attracting a certain amount of attention. I also walked with her in London, along the Thames, and on her famous London history walks, and she was the perfect companion, a mine of fascinating information on the city she always thought of as home. And it was on one of those walks that she and I had lunch by the river, again in a pub, and thrashed out the title for her forthcoming book, Fiefs and Vassals, the Medieval Evidence Reinterpreted. I'm afraid I'm at least partly to blame for that cumbersome subtitle. On the walks, throughout her visits, at the dinner table, Susan loved to discuss and especially to argue about history, but about anything really. As my husband always says, controversy was her pleasure. A discussion where everyone agreed would not suit. Not that she was always earnest, and she was never po-faced. She liked to enunciate points of view with which she radically disagreed, especially politically conservative points of view, in an extreme satirical fashion. Her political stance was, of course, left of centre, and openly so. It was Susan, after all, who went on one of those great Save the NHS marches, carrying her homemade placard proclaiming, "I want to pay more taxes." But her greatest pleasure was discussing and arguing about history. And many a dinner ended that way, and inevitably and finally, with the compact English dictionary and a magnifying glass on the table as we pored over the meaning and use of some word. A different side of Susan appeared on her holidays in France. Susan's house parties were memorable, and I'm going to be brief on them since there's so many people here who must have their own memories of them. This was my only experience of Susan the organiser, or as she herself would put it with her customary frankness, bossy Susan. The days were your own, though she might occasionally give us a nudge. You could go for a walk today. The evenings involved a communal dinner, which we took turns in cooking, but often with advice. The Staffords liked to provide first courses, but the Staffords were always firmly told that we don't do first courses. If Susan was bossy, the Staffords were bolshy, and we did do first courses, and Susan always graciously accepted them. I must say, I became quite pleased that she was never my head of department. But Susan was essentially a very human and a very humane person, so good with children. Especially in her later years, some saw her as a bit formidable. I never could. After all, I'd seen her reducing bath time for 2 small boys to waterlogged chaos, and demonstrating to 3 children how to pick up and eat cherries without using your hands, with your mouth alone. I leave you to imagine that Susan. She must have been a very good dean, a job in which she dealt with students, including those anguishing over approaching exams. She often told me that her response to the most agitated was to take them out in her car to the car wash. I must admit, I've never shared her faith in the calming effect of sitting in a box, being assaulted by drenching water and revolving brushes, but she swore by it, and presumably practice was proof. Susan was so disarmingly ready to acknowledge her own frailties or problems. When she was chair of the examiners in Oxford, she was faced with a particularly obstreperous and overbearing board member, who shall remain nameless. She told us how she worried about it all, how it gave her sleepless nights, and how on one occasion she woke in the night and found herself worrying about the ornaments on the mantelpiece. Typically Susan, the one who said, "I worry, therefore I am." But also typically Susan, her reaction. That finally showed her that she just had to pull herself together, get on with it, and stand up to him. Hint, it was a him. Which she did, and I gather very successfully. Typically Susan. She was also both frank and open about the rejections of her work, which she suffered throughout her academic life, of articles, even of books, including the unpublished manuscript of Nations. We've all been there at some time, and young academics especially, and she must have known how much they appreciated such honesty from so famous a historian. In all this time, she never ceased to be my teacher, and a demanding one. I had very few encounters with her which didn't begin with the question, "What are you working on now?" very soon followed by, "And when will you finish it?" Our historical interests increasingly diverged after those Stubbsian early years, but that didn't stop me sending her work to read, and it certainly never stopped her commenting on it, usually to good effect. And as my last book took shape, Susan was turning 90. She bemoaned the fact that she could no longer cope with a book-length manuscript, so I decided to send her the conclusion, which she read, commented on, and improved. Without her, I wonder will I ever finish another thing. So that was the Susan I knew, as a teacher and always as a friend. And I miss her.
Yeah, I want to say thank you, Pauline, but she's not here, so hopefully she will see the recording. I would like to add thank you, Pauline, for a particularly heartfelt conclusion. So, hopefully, a picture frozen and then stopping sharing is as bad as our technical maladies will get. Please cross your fingers and touch any of those wood. So let's move on to our second speaker, Frances Lamb. Frances is the former Vice Principal and Principal of Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, where Susan taught, and is a colleague of Susan for many years. She's a specialist in Iberia from the 19th century onwards, and is here in person, firstly, to give her reflections on Susan's time at Oxford, and particularly as a colleague. Frances.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Can I sit here?
Yes,
This is all right.
Actually, they can see you, actually, I think.
Right. Hello, everyone. I'm terribly pleased to have this really precious opportunity to pay tribute to Susan Reynolds as both teacher and colleague. She was a very important person for me. I first met Susan in December 1978, quite a long time ago, when she interviewed me for a place to read history at Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, where she was fellow and tutor in medieval history. She taught me 3 courses in my first year, before I abandoned the Middle Ages, by the way, but we won't go into that. And most fortunately for me, she was also my personal tutor throughout my time as an undergraduate. As a tutor, Susan was both intellectually challenging and kind. Everyone saw the intellectual challenge on their first meeting and discovered the kindness some little while afterwards, not long afterwards. A fellow student from my year that I spoke to just a few nights ago recalls that first attending tutorials with Susan was a very big shock after leaving school. Encountering Susan's sharp mind was a bracing, combative, always combative, and enjoyable experience. It was too early in her career for students to learn, as they had to later, to avoid the F word, but we certainly quickly learned to use analytical terms carefully. We all remember her pouncing on words or phrases and demanding, "But what do you mean? What do you mean?" It might be race, or power, or nation, or class, or faith, or even, much worse, an age of faith. Oh dear, what do you mean? What do you mean? So concise use of language was the first element of the invaluable scholarly discipline that Susan inculcated. The second, equally important, was a skeptical approach to both secondary and primary sources. It was no good quoting an eminent historian to clinch an argument. Susan respected great historians, of course, but explained that while they might be our authority for making some claim, their opinions did not constitute evidence. And when she became a very eminent historian herself, a little while later, this criterion would never have changed. Where was the evidence was always the question. Not who said it or who claimed it, where was the evidence? And it was similarly crucial to interrogate primary sources and investigate how, for what purpose, when, by whom they had been created. Never take anything at face value. Interrogate, interrogate. What an exceptional intellectual foundation she gave us for historical studies and also for life. As a personal tutor, Susan was generous, supportive, and imaginative. There were, I think, 12 of us in my year. Once a year, she would take us out in groups of 3 in her car to visit a site of historical interest and then give us a very nice pub lunch. Oxford's short terms could be intense and indeed claustrophobic. These lovely excursions were hugely appreciated. One friend of mine remembers visiting the glorious medieval tithe bar at Great Coxwell. I remember vividly, even after more than 50 years, a truly illuminating day with Susan, visiting first the grand pre-Reformation church at Elm with its associations with the Chaucer family and the Tudors, and then the 18th century church at Chiselhampton. I don't know if you know it. A simple rectangle filled with box pews and built not for sacramental liturgy, but for hearing the scriptures and the sermon. So in one morning, an exceptional architectural introduction to the very dramatic discontinuities, historically, of the English church. And then a good lunch. Susan was a generous host, and we got to know her better, informally. In 1977, I was fortunate enough to return to LMH as the Modern European history tutor, and therefore a colleague of Susan's, both in the history school and on the college's governing body, for almost 10 years, until she retired from her Oxford post. She was a wonderful colleague, well organised, energetic, and always positive. In addition to all her work with undergraduate and postgraduate history students, she made specific contributions to the college as a whole, including professionalising the archives and acting as a notably businesslike but also sympathetic dean of undergraduates. On policy matters on governing body, Susan was open to change, and as I'm sure you'll all recognise, usually on the radical side. She was not swayed by nostalgic appeals to tradition. She had no hesitation in voting for LMH to go coeducational at the end of the 1970s, after 100 years as a college for women only, and worked to ensure a smooth, very undramatic transition. She was not remotely interested in cliques or cabals. I remember her always as direct, rational, getting on with the job, and always dedicated to scholarly research. We knew that Susan's intellectual centre of gravity was in London. Indeed, the moment term finished, off she went, to return only just before the next term began. The centre of gravity intellectually was definitely in London, and especially here at the Institute of Historical Research. No one in college was surprised when she took early retirement to concentrate on research, though she was greatly missed. Susan's contribution to LMH as a teacher and colleague was immense. I think especially as an inspiring, memorable teacher. Not the last time I saw her, but I think the last time I saw her in LMH was in 2015. There was a one-day conference and reunion for history alumni, which she attended. Almost 30 years after she retired from her Oxford post, Susan sat surrounded by her former students in a series of searching interventions and probing questions to participants. She reminded us all again of how privileged we had been to be taught and formed by her, and indeed we were.
And thank you so much, Francis, for those reflections. It's a real sense of what a kind and generous, at the same time challenging, in the best way, the best thing in that word, which is how I was encountered, colleague she was. So we're now going to move over to our American colleagues, who are very generously giving up their time at what is for them quite an early hour. It's about 9 a.m. On the east coast of the United States. So they're going to join us in the following order. So Canada, from Susan's time at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, we have Janet Lowengardt, Gina Garthwaite, and Elizabeth or Peggy Brown. And they're going to be introduced in that order, and they're going to talk via Zoom. And I just hope that the images work, people's internet connections are after this. Fingers crossed. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Janet Lowengardt.
Is a friend, and I miss her. We were both historians, but we worked in different areas. I don't think we ever contemplated the existence or non-existence of feudalism. Of course, there was the debate about the nation state and a wonderful, lengthy correspondence about Shakespeare and law. But the point is that when we disagreed, and we often did, and when we defended our positions heartily, which we usually did, we always ended on excellent terms and ready for the next meeting. But when I think of Susan, I think of her kindness, which she would never admit to, and her generosity and her indomitable will. I think of somebody who, when she saw a homeless person in the tube station, would not only drop a coin into his cap, but make an encouraging comment. It's very important to say something, not just fling money, she explained. She was generous. She loved teaching. And one time my class got the benefit of it. She was visiting me and she said she would lecture to them. And it was brilliant. They loved it. She was also brave. I remember when she broke her wrist in the middle of a conference in Chicago. She let me pack her suitcase for her hasty trip home, but she wouldn't let me go with her to the airport on the grounds that she could still both walk and talk. She had just given an important paper, and yet she saw herself as something of an outsider. And as a result, she was pleased to learn that she was not, as she said in her comments when she accepted an award of an honorary fellowship in the American Society for Legal History. None of this goes to Susan's formidable intelligence or her path-breaking work. And none of it really deals with the IHR and her fondness for it and her friends and colleagues there. But maybe it does explain why I was so glad to have her as a friend.
Thank you, Janet. We move on now to Jean Agarthwaite. Jean is, like Francis, not a medievalist, as his colleague Susan's at Dartmouth, and specialist in Persian history, and delighted in this today. Jean, when you're ready.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to reflect on Susan at Dartmouth and after. Susan came to Dartmouth in the academic year 1986-87, first because of a house swap proposed by Charlie Wood, who had a sabbatical coming in the UK, that he and Susan would simply change houses for the year, and then he arranged for her appointment as visiting professor, where she would do some teaching, given her distinguished publications, even before her monumental Fiefs and Vassals of 1994. Happily, Charlie and his wife, Susan's commodious house on North Balch was in walking distance of campus in central Hanover and perfectly suited to Susan, as was Susan's Lennox Garden flat for Charlie and Susan in London. Winter and the Woods furnace was something of a challenge for Susan, with her repeated calls to a heating and oil specialist. And she was impressed, and all the problems were solved when the CEO himself came to finally sort out all of the furnace failures. Typically for Susan, there was no problem that could not be resolved with her determination. Dartmouth students are leery of visiting faculty classes, but not Susan's. Her engagement with them resulted in the Daily Dartmouth profile her as the Monty Python of historians. In the years after her time with us, Susan often commented how much she learned about teaching while at Dartmouth, especially from David Lagomarsino, with whom she co-taught an introductory course on medieval and early modern Europe. While at Dartmouth, too, Susan developed her Mac computer skills under the tutelage of Gail Patton, the department's administrator. Susan valued the history department's culture of openness, commitment to world and comparative history, and the range of interaction on campus, in seminars, and the continuing of lively discussions off campus on social occasions. We all quickly learned the value of her deep knowledge and critical eye. Her culinary skills were often shown at dinners on North Balch or at faculty potlucks. She delighted in pitching in on friends' projects, whether academic or not, but one notable case was helping to lay the stones in Gail's new walkway. Hanover as a base allowed for her enthusiasm for exploration that even included learning how to cross-country ski. However, on her second try, she demurred, given her concern for falling. Walks were merely the norm. Hanover's proximity to Montreal also allowed her to reconnect with her World War II host, who had taken her and her sisters in during the war, And after 1987, Susan would return to Hanover often on her way to conferences and lectures, and to give us one here too. For many of us, our friendships with Susan not only continued, but deepened when she returned to London. On our research trips, there were always long discussions, meals, walks in the Chilterns or the Norfolk Broads, or rainy Sunday afternoons along the Thames that became something of an in-joke. Concerts and theater. Some of our children became friends of hers too, and on their own accompanied her to opera and to dinner. As evident at Dartmouth, she simply delighted in being with young people. And then too were the holidays in France, first in the Dordogne at La Bergerie, then especially Vers-sur-Mer in Normandy, and at the last one in 2017 in Northumberland. Susan, with her spreadsheets for room occupancy and organizational skills for meals and excursions, brought family, colleagues, and friends from all over together for a number of days or several weeks of spirited conversation and fun. The walks could be longer as we explored the environs of Crépont or Mauvain, or she led us to Chartres or the Bayeux Tapestry, or the beaches and the memorials. We all know Susan's knowledge, curiosity, critical thinking, and commitment to social justice. In her last months, she lamented the fact that she couldn't take on the research on the subject of race in the Middle Ages. Her political values, which she wore on her sleeve, could be encompassed with her sense of humor. During the Thatcher years, she carried a card that stated that she not be visited by the Prime Minister were she hospitalized. Susan thought that Thatcher had crossed over to perform the monarch's duties, even though, and of course, Susan was a Republican. Their paths nearly crossed, however, once. On returning from there, three of us were able to get a table at the Ivy, a restaurant for whom Susan's father, Hugh, had resolved its legal problems, and on very short notice, for a limited period of time. We had to be out of there by 8 o'clock. The next morning, we saw why, for the newspapers showed Thatcher and Gorbachev seated at our table. Another good laugh. Susan's long years revealed her many achievements, not the least of which was her love for her family and her commitment and engagement with friends from her many worlds. Curiosity, balance, and the sense of who she was added richness to her life and to ours. Thank you, Susan.
And thank you, Jean, for those really interesting and enlightening. You probably didn't hear the laugh you got about the line not being visited by Thatcher, but it went down very, very well. So thank you once again. We now move on to the final speaker in this session, Peggy Brown, Elizabeth Brown, who is Professor Emerita of History at Brooklyn College, City University of New York. Obviously, known, like Susan, her writings on, or you've encountered the F word, we probably ought to say it, feudalism. In 2009, Peggy was elected the second Vice President of the Medieval Academy of America, and in 2010 served as its president. A groundbreaking article, The Tyranny of a Construct, Feudalism and Historians of Medieval Europe. Peggy initiated ongoing discussions whether the use of the term feudalism is a useful construct for understanding medieval society, one which Susan may have engaged with herself. But Peggy, I'll leave this. I will stop talking. I'll pass you over and let you say a few words of your own. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Susan recalls that it was in 2006 that she recalled that we had not met in person until 1980, 6 years after I started my crusade against the feudal system and everything feudal. It was 14 years after that she published Fiefs and Vassals, in which she launched her own feudal crusade, and we were companions in arms from then on, and indeed before and until her sad death. She was a staunch ally, but I remember her for so many other things: her friendship, her loyalty, the way in which throughout the years we knew each other, she was there for me, and her relatives and friends, particularly Vicky and Peter and Kate, became my almost family and my friends. And my family, Ralph, our daughter Vicky, and our son Alexander, became her almost family, and my friends, her friends. She was wonderful. She loved walking. She loved finding wildflowers. How she knew the Latin names of all the flowers we had in Connecticut, I will never know. And know them. She did things like, she dressed me when I was going to visit the muniments at Westminster Abbey, including providing me with white gloves that she insisted were necessary after consulting Barbara Harvey. She covered for me when I had to miss an appointment at the National Gallery to see the ambassadors being restored in a wonderful way. And I share special memories of our visits together to Pierre Chaplet in his grove and house near Oxford. Now, I knew Susan well, not that well, but well, before the day in 1980 when we first met. She had clasped to her breast a copy of Marc Bloch's La Société Féodale, so that I would be able to pick her out of the trash. I knew her for her meticulous and exacting scholarship, which drew my totally boundless admiration. I had read at least one of the articles she devoted to London in the early 1970s, and I was bowled over by what I still consider perhaps her real masterpiece, the study of the forged charters of Barnstable, which she published in the English Historical Review in 1969. That she had been advised and helped and counseled by Pierre Chaplet, who was already one of my heroes, led me to be even more filled with admiration, and I must admit, a touch of envy. I love the way she disentangled the evidence and illuminated the fraud. I could hardly wait for her to turn her attention to the other municipalities in England and find out what they had forged in order to promote themselves. But Susan found, as she admitted in the article, the evidence very arid. She picked apart the evidence and then was left with virtually nothing except denouncing the people who had invented stories to cover up the evidence that didn't exist. I was drawn to her too because of her, as she was frustrated with what she called this arid evidence, she became eloquent about her interest in terms and labels. And in one of her articles, she denounced labels, let me quote, that convey a deceptive air of precision, which discourages further attempts at analysis. That so mirrors exactly what I was after in feudalism, that last night I went back to my article to see if I had used those words, and I hadn't, but it's exactly the same sentiment. He encouraged historians to look critically both at the evidence and at the words with which we transmute it into history. I envy her those phrases. It's clear that our intellectual companionship and friendship were predetermined and foreordained. No wonder feudalism brought us together and kept us together over the years. Now, I really wish we had at least tried to write a book together. In the interview she did for the IRH in 2008, Susan said it was a good thing we didn't. Because we have different views about footnotes and how she could think footnotes are minor, that's another. In any case, that's not the way I remember it. I think we could have reconciled those differences. Susan said, in a couple of places, that we didn't do it because I was busy with other things. Now, that's not the way I remember it. Remember, it was 6 years between her reading my article and our actually meeting. And as you know, Susan, when she got an idea in her head and the bit between her teeth, it was very difficult to dislodge it. And she had already decided that what she wanted to do was to investigate the medieval evidence about fiefs and vassals, which medievalists had long taken as key institution of feudalism. She agreed with me that this approach had produced a distorted view of the Middle Ages, and certainly at the end, and I think maybe she realized at the beginning, that this was a very negative approach, since she showed that the evidence that had been presumed to exist, in fact, did not exist, which is what she had done with the Barnstable forgery. Now, what I was looking for was a brief anecdote. In 1973, I think before I submitted the article to the American Historical Review, I showed it to Fred Cheyenne, a mutual colleague, and Fred read through it, licked his lips, and said, "Don't publish now. Wait until I have shown how it really was." And I thought, well, Fred, I'll take it under advisement. And had I done as he asked, I would have waited 30 years. But he put the bee in my bonnet. And what I saw what he was getting at, because of the construct, we didn't have any idea of how medieval landholding in all global and medieval clientage worked in the different ages of this 1,500 years or 1,000 years we call the Middle Ages. And that's something that needs understanding. So what I wanted to do was to find out how it really was by looking at Tosh, little bits of that huge expanse of medieval Europe, and also looking at the terms to see the way in which the terms varied in their usage over time. I was also fascinated to find out who invented the feudal constructs and how they came into being. The case studies Ted Evergates and Emily Tabuteau were both doing that wonderfully arid, maybe it may be arid, but it's certainly necessary work to find out how things actually operated in Champagne and also in Normandy. Nobody was then working on the development of these tyrannical constructs. And so what I wanted to do was a joint book in which we explored some of these topics. But Susan had her heart set on Fiefs and Vassals, and so we parted ways. She did encourage my pursuit of trying to understand how the construct developed and spread, which I thought was pretty funny. But it was I think it was really too complex and idiosyncratic for Susan's taste. And I showed her what I was finding. It was a little too complex. And she wrote me in 1987 and urged me to cut down on the detail and the footnotes and on the analysis. Now, to her distinct credit, Susan recognized there was a lot to do after she had slain the monstrous Fiefs and Vassals, and also come up with her non-negative, her positive suggestion, which she and I sparred over for many an hour, that it was professional lawyers who were somehow responsible for using systematized feudalism as a means of increasing, developing royal power in the 12th century and beyond. Now, she herself called for investigation of collective ideas and activity. Now, whereas I am hoping that her brilliant demonstration of the futility of pursuing Fiefs and Vassals will serve as further impetus, together with the work of Fred Fayette and Box and many others, to undertake study of the complexities of property holding, clientage, service, and payments in the huge expanse of medieval Europe, how it really was. Susan, thank you for all you have given us to inspire us, make us think, goad us on. And in the au-delà, please forgive me for preferring the Barnstable forgeries to works with fewer footnotes and more analysis.
And thank you, Peggy, for that wonderful account of your relationship and alluding to one of the great lost books, I think. That would have been one that would have reshaped curricula evermore, even if you couldn't agree on the footnotes, which is a real shame. At this point, I think it's only fair to invite other people to reflect and offer their reflections and contributions on their experience of Susan and her work and her colleagueship, if that's right, if that's a word, and her friendship. We have a microphone, and it may be that our American colleagues can't hear this. You will be able to hear the recording, and I will try and relay any questions or any points that come through. But if someone would like to act as a roving microphone carrier, Claire has very kindly offered. So if anyone would like to say something, now is the time to do so. And for the benefit of our American listeners, could you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you. I'm Hilary, Susan's niece. Thank you very much, Peggy. I enjoyed listening to your talk, and I was thinking that you finally had the opportunity to set the record straight without being interrupted.
Is there anybody else who would like to say anything at this point?
Are you all too cowed by Susan's non-presence? Susan will have something to say, I'm sure. But alas, she cannot be with us. So, if there is no one else... Oh, yes.
Thank you very much for all those wonderful talks. I'm Katie Cubitt, I'm a historian of early medieval Britain. It's so wonderful to remember Susan and remember such breadth of riches. And I'm very struck because Susan's rigour was so laser sharp and it was so devoted to kind of dissecting concepts. But Peggy, your talk particularly made me realise and remember and really appreciate that both in your work and her work, it's not just to do with dismantling constructs, it was also to do with setting something up in its place. And very often as rigorous medieval historians, we fall into the trap of what I call negative positivism, in which we spend our time pointing out the flaws and we don't have the courage to put something in its place. And she was so creative and interesting in that way, and indeed in your own work too, I think. But that's just something that I've reflected on as a result of these talks.
Thank you. Is there anybody else? No? Okay. Well, at that point, I think we should draw this session to a conclusion, which, by happy coincidence, is exactly the point in the calendar where it should have drawn to a conclusion, and as should the first break. So I'd like to thank, once again, all our contributors, Pauline, Francis, Janet, Peggy and Jean, for their wonderful contributions and their insights into Susan as a colleague, scholar, friend, teacher, and many, many other things besides. And I think at that point, I'd particularly thank our American colleagues for sparing the time and allowing us to hear their views. It's been a huge pleasure. Thank you so much. And once again, my apologies for the internet, for the technical difficulties we experienced earlier. I think it's only fair that we now let you go and enjoy the rest of your day, and I will let you know as and when the recordings are available so you can hear what you missed. But thank you once again. It's we hugely appreciate it. Goodbye. I now thank you all for your patience. I'm now going to hand you over to Claire.